Well, let's start with the situation in the Gaza Strip. After carrying out relentless airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, Israel's Defense Minister Neve Gordon is told is meant to be ready for a ground offensive. Israel has, of course, massed tens of thousands of troops along the border with the Gaza Strip. All of this following the October 7 cross-border terrorist massacre by Hamas terrorists. Meeting Israel's infantry soldiers on the Gaza border, the Israeli Defense Minister urged the troops to be organized and be ready. He didn't, however, mention a time when the invasion would actually begin. As Israel continues to pound Gaza, new satellite images show a number of people taking shelter in schools and hospitals around Gaza City, and that obviously will have its own potential repercussions. We all know what happened with that incident at the hospital in Gaza, which created so many headlines and so much misinformation earlier this week. The biggest concern around the world, of course, is the possible expansion of the conflict from Gaza into Lebanon. What is Hezbollah going to do? What is the stance that Iran is going to take? What could happen on Syria? All of those concerns are, of course, uppermost in the minds of the world. India's own stance on this continues to be somewhat nuanced and increasingly nuanced. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had, of course, begun just after the October 7th terror attack by Hamas with this very clear condemnation of terrorism. This is the tweet he had put out on the 7th of October. But subsequently, India has also been talking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also tweeted about his interaction with the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and the fact that he is going on expressing India's long-standing situation on the Palestinian issue. And now for the very latest on the situation in Israel and also in the Gaza Strip, I'm now being joined by my colleague, Jody Cohen. Jody, what can you tell us?
Hi Vikram, Sue asked what the current situation is like in Israel, and I'll just give you an idea of the updates that we've seen in the past 4 hours alone from the Israel Defense Forces. Now, firstly, Israeli troops came under attack on the Lebanese border. They returned fire, and there is currently a search for potential infiltrators into northern Israel. Israel also had a barrage of rockets into the south and centre of the country, with Hamas claiming to have targeted Jerusalem, which, remember, contains the sites holy to Judaism, Christianity and Islam. The Israeli police said they found 4 Gazans hiding in the southern town of Beersheba, and following thousands of Hamas terrorists infiltrating into Israel in the 7th of October attack, it's thought that perhaps dozens remain inside Israel. Now, following rockets from Gaza and Lebanon, the IDF says it struck Hamas and Hezbollah targets overnight and are evacuating more residents from the north of the country to the centre, as they have done with residents in the south. In addition, the IDF says Israel is gearing up for potential attacks by the Iranian-backed Houthis after the US Navy intercepted missiles and drones from Yemen, which were thought to be heading towards Israel. So Israel is dealing with infiltrators within Israel, Hamas and Hezbollah, rockets across the country, and is now facing the prospect of others potentially joining in. So it's certainly a tense time. This is Jody Cohen for WION World as One.
Well, there's been so much talk in recent days about human rights and what should human rights be and how can they be protected? How do you prevent a humanitarian crisis like what we are seeing in West Asia at the present moment? Also, what exactly does the rule of law actually mean? This has been a very major subject of discussion at multiple forums over the last few days. So for more on that, we're now being joined by Neve Gordon, who's a professor of human rights law at the Queen Mary University in London. Professor Gordon, thank you so much for joining us. What is your, as a professor of human rights law, what is your understanding of the situation that we are seeing right now? Both the terror attacks that we saw, the Hamas terror attacks, and the humanitarian crisis that we are seeing now in Gaza.
It's both human rights law and the laws of war, international humanitarian law. And according to the laws of war, it is legal to kill combatants, but it is illegal to kill non-combatants or civilians. So civilians and civilian sites are protected, and acts that deliberately or intend to kill civilians are considered war crimes. So what we saw on Saturday the 7th is clearly an act of war crimes committed by Hamas inside Israel. And immediately following the attack, we have been seeing Israel's response, which has also led to the death of thousands of civilians already. And these two war crimes, because, as I said, civilians, according to international law, are protected.
Now, Professor Gordon, the argument that the Israelis are making in this case is that if in any war, if the combatants, Hamas in this case, are sheltering behind civilians, hiding behind civilians, or in places that have intense civilian populations, then what happens? You can't just carry out a terror attack and say, okay, now we're hiding in civilian neighborhoods and there's nothing that you can now do to us. That's the point the Israelis are making.
Precisely. So what we see today is that many wars today are being carried out in civilian spaces, in cities or outside of cities. And what we see militaries often doing is framing the civilians that are in the cities. Instead of civilians, they're calling them human shields. And they're saying that Hamas is using the Palestinian civilians as human shields to defend against Israeli attacks. And then when Israel shoots at Hamas and kills civilians, Israel claims it is not our fault, it is Hamas's fault because they are hiding behind these civilians. Whereby in international law, it's actually not legal because it contravenes what is called the principle of proportionality, where the attack needs to be carried out in proportion to the damage that is carried out.
Right, you mentioned proportionality, and that concept is being discussed widely in the media also in the recent past. I just wanted to understand from you legally, what exactly does proportionality mean? I mean, if 1,300 civilians have been killed by Hamas, then does proportionality mean that there are a particular number of Palestinians or civilians who can legitimately be killed or become a target before it actually becomes a war crime? Or if not that, then what does proportionality mean?
So proportionality will not deal with the Israeli citizens that have been killed. It is the assessment or evaluation of what I aim to achieve in attack. So, for example, if the target is a high-ranking Hamas militant versus the expected amount of civilians that will be killed while I killed the high-targeting Hamas militant. And what we see is often in situations of war where a warring party will increase the value of its target in order to suggest that it was proportional. But is it proportional regardless of what we think this target is, the head of Hamas's northern region? Is it proportional to kill him knowing that at the same time I'm going to kill 30 or 40 or 50 civilians? And what we see often is that those civilians, instead of having names and dreams and life stories, are referred to as statistics, as collateral damage, and that just precipitates the cycle of violence. We have to understand that when we shoot, we kill people that have parents and have children and so forth. And what we need now in the Middle East is not the escalation of fighting, but actually a call for de-escalation.
So one other question with some legal implications, I guess, that has to be asked. Supposing, as is happening in this case, the Israelis are saying you need to evacuate. You need to move out of those areas in the Gaza city as civilians so that you don't get killed when we are attacking. You need to move away. You need to move below the line. You need to go below the Wadi Gaza. Now, many in the Palestinian side will say, how do we do that? Where do we evacuate? There's no place to move out. Strikes are happening even in the south of Gaza. So is this a legitimate thing to say? To say, evacuate. And if you're still there, then in a sense, it's your own fault.
We have a 24-hour evacuation order for 1.1 million people. Many of, half the population in Gaza are children. We have the sickly, we have the elderly. And so trying to move in 24 hours is very difficult. And now we have evidence coming that Israel bombed a convoy of people moving south with killing 70 Palestinians in that bombing.
All right, Professor Gordon, just one last question I wanted to ask you. In the recent past, we've had this entire situation, the row that's taking place between India and Canada on the charges of targeted assassinations, the allegations made by Canada, with no evidence that has been made publicly yet, I must hasten to add, that India struck a person of terrorist sympathies in Canadian soil. Now, I have to say, this has been a subject which many people have been thinking about or discussing about the legal aspects of this. The entire point on targeted assassinations or extrajudicial killings as a concept, as a theory, what does the law say about targeted assassinations of a terrorist as opposed to declaring war and going inside and bombing and blowing up a large number of places? Because you could have one argument saying targeted assassinations are wrong, they run contrary to the laws of war, the rule of law. Another view could potentially be that surely a targeted assassination of a potential terrorist is better than actually going and killing a lot of civilians by declaring war. This entire issue may come up in Israel also in connection with what Mossad used to do earlier. What does law actually say about all of this?
The law does not allow targeted assassinations except in the context of war where you're targeting a combatant. Okay. So if it's not in the context of war, then what the law requires is due process. You don't say someone is guilty and then kill them. You have to bring them to trial, prove their guilt, and put them in jail for the rest of their life if you manage to prove it. So targeted they're called extrajudicial executions. They're called executions that carried out without recourse to the law, which is extremely problematic.
All right, Professor Gordon, thank you so much. As Professor of Human Rights Law, you've helped us to decode what law actually says about many of these really tricky situations. So thank you so much for being with us.